All right, we are now recording, and Amy Nurnberger, Program Head of Research Data Management Services at MIT, if you'd like to go ahead and start.
Well, thank you so much, Moira, and everyone for allowing me this great opportunity to talk to you about, yeah, Scott.
We're not seeing your slides. We're seeing the presenter view.
Oh,
We're seeing
thank
the
you so
wrong
much for that.
screen.
Yeah, I hear you. Just 1 minute. There we go. Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. Once again, thank you so much for having me here. Fabulous opportunity to talk to you all about why do libraries keep on showing up to your compute meetings, especially when it comes to data? What's up with that? What's going on with all of those things? Why do we care so much, and why do we keep on raising our hands and using the same word to mean different things from what you think it means, and really getting into like where libraries are coming from, why they're involved in this space, and hopefully opening up some of that space for us to, you know, have a better understanding and move into that collaboration and useful engagement. So, why libraries? What we're going to talk about today is, first of all, libraries. What do they do anyway, especially within the academic space? What, as librarians, many of us have degrees in something called information sciences or studies. What does that even mean? I'm thinking about data. What does it mean when we say data? What are we thinking about from the library's perspective about what's included in that space? And then moving on to, where are the connections to computing? Where do these overlap? Where do we have shared interests? And then thinking about some of those places where we often run into confusion, and continuing on to Excelsior, how we can do stuff productively together for our research communities. With that, if you have questions, please do just pop them in chat, and Moira will either flag me or I will get to them. And you can also put them into the call document. Please sign into the call document if you haven't yet. All right. So first of all, what do academic libraries do? Well, when we think about this from the library perspective, one of our first goals is thinking about supporting education. When we think about education, we know that we're educating both our student population, but we're also often educating our researcher population. So thinking about that entire population of the educational institute that we're located in. We're also thinking about, what do we educate people on? What's the best atmosphere for education? What are those resources? So we're collecting and providing access to a large diversity of knowledge, ideas, information types, media types, thinking about all of those different aspects. And this is really in the service of both supporting the well-being of our broad academic community. And we often think of that both locally as our academic community, as well as globally. What is that scholarly community that we're a part of, that we're in conversation with? And how our researchers speak with other researchers, how we come together in that space of scholarship, and thinking about those principles of research, of scholarship. How does this feed into what is often an ideal of open society, and thinking about what are some of the rights that are inherent, implicit along with that open society, that support integrity, that support decision making, that what's necessary for those in terms of providing that fixed reference point. Reliable research is an aspect of this, thinking about how resources, evidence exist, are examined and understood in terms of being able to verify, to cite what approaches a commonly shared truth, if one might have that phrase. We're frequently rooted in the community as well, in thinking about its cultural, historical identity, and thinking about how all of these things that humanity have produced in that space of knowledge, of information, of scholarship, how this carries us collectively forward in these spaces, and how important it is to know what that past consisted of in order to create those next steps as we move forward. Now, this is all very high-minded, right? And so, as a profession, we have this system of ethics. We are very much have the statement that we are grounded in an informed citizenry, that we are committed to intellectual freedom, the freedom of access to information. And we have within libraries, as members of the library profession, this obligation to support, to ensure, to enable all of those words, that flow of information and ideas from past generations across current generation to future generations. Now, again, this is all very like, oh, in that space, but we also know that we have shortcomings in the profession, right? And this is very much in that space that we have termed vocation, that is termed vocational awe. That while there are many ideals associated with libraries and what their grand goals are, it's not all good all the time. And libraries really, truly should be critiqued, and should be questioned. It's not all good stuff all the time. So really balancing that idealism with that aspect of humility, that openness to be part of the larger community, to partake in critiques and expanding our own knowledge, in terms of how people are interfacing with data and information. Which really brings me to this space of information science and information studies. This is where, as librarians, as a profession, this is what we're degreed in, right? We have a full set of different labeled degrees, everything from a master's in libraries and information science to a master of science in information studies to a master's. Is all sorts. You take those words and you put them in a blender, and it spits out all of these degrees, that are certified generally by the American Library Association as you have the imprimatur of being a librarian. Congratulations. And that's one way that people come into the libraries. Librarians are actually often coming into libraries from other subject areas, other disciplines, other careers, other professions, and are bringing that expertise and that experience into library spaces. So that's something to think about as well with that. So when we think about information science, what this really is we're talking about this immensely interdisciplinary field that is focused on not just the collection, classification, manipulation, storage, retrieval, and communication of information. It's also taking into consideration understanding how people are interacting with information, how society, how culture is influenced and influences the production of information, and thinking about those gaps and how they're bridged between users and information technologies, thinking about how are technologies built well to emphasize user-centered design, data analytics, information architecture, and really truly getting to that social impact of information. So we're taking those human dimensions, combining them with information organization, and also bringing in those computational aspects around informatics, data science, network theory, discrete mathematics, right? And thinking about how all of those things intersect in this space of libraries and the information ecology, that is often centered in and around libraries and is part of the goal of our academic institutions in pursuit of research and scholarship. And this idea that the information of information studies is truly a continually emerging discipline because it's evolving from that convergence of librarianship and the science of information itself. And as we continue to explore, develop more around understanding components of information, whether it's from the cognitive aspect of how brains really work, how humans truly process information, or from that aspect of how our technologies are evolving to extend and expand what can be done with different types of information, whether that's thinking about the manipulation of bits and bytes by increasingly complex algorithms, or thinking about how you're going to extract new information from that bone that's been sitting in the Museum of Natural History for the past 100 years. All of this is a part of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about these information systems. So we're thinking about information very broadly defined, both those bytes that are often considered data, as well as all of those other different aspects. Now, we get to this space and we're like, okay, so what's the data? When we say data, how are we really approaching that topic of data? How do we define that? And I would like to caution everyone, I am grammatically unpure. I will use data as both a singular and as a plural. So my apologies if this irritates you, but you have been forewarned. Just setting your expectations there. So what do we mean when we're talking about research data specifically, which is often the data that we're concerned with in our spaces, right? So we're thinking about facts as that very broad space of a thing that happened. There was an event. There was a thing, and it happened. It existed. It's not an opinion. It's not a legal aspect. It's a real thing that happened, and that's this fact. And then enclosed in that space of factism are data. These are facts, measurements, recordings, observations, with not too much interpretation really attached to it. Then we get to research data, which are, if we take the government definition of research data, it is the recorded factual material accepted as necessary to validate research findings. And this is kind of the night you're like, we finally got there. This is research data. And yet, it isn't. Because research data is now moving into this definition of scientific data that we see more and more funders really engaging with. So we go as from necessary to validate research findings into this space, as you can see with the NIH, they're like validate and replicate research. That makes it a little bit different, right? With the DOE, you're thinking about also that validation and replication. And the NSF is like, oh, no, we want to make sure you understand what we're talking about here. We're like, all of the things, the data, the samples, the software, the inventions, the curricular material, and all of those materials that are gathered in the course of execution of a grant. So that just took us from what's necessary to support a finding to all of these things, right? So that idea that it's settled fact what data are, it's a constantly changing definition of what we're talking about when we're thinking about what these data are. And to really help extend on this, as we know, research data can exist as text, as structured or rectangular data. It might be image files. It could be audio files, video, maps and GIS data are part of that, as well as software and code also fit into these spaces and are extended even further as we think about, so what are the tools that are necessary to create that replicable research? What are the supporting information that's necessary for that contextual understanding? What are the metadata that make these data interoperable in our electronic systems, our electronic information systems that provide further information there? And so these things might include analysis scripts. Metadata might include all sorts of different information, right? And might not even exist as a consistently structured machine readable thing. Often the most frequent type of metadata I see are README files, right? This is part of the metadata that provides that context, in addition to your standard instrument settings or patient information or conditions around when the test was given, which are also a type of metadata for some research studies. And along with that, survey instruments, data dictionary, code books. And to be clear, when I say code books, I do not mean computer code. I mean, what do those funny 3 letters mean in that spreadsheet? How do you translate that code? And that is your code book. So thinking about that as part of the contextual information that is utterly necessary to understand what those data might mean. Because oftentimes people, they might forget to record what units that thing was measured in, as in the classic case of the first Mars rover, where we had a little issue between English and metric measurements. Caused great consternation. If only they had a code book. Now, of course, in research, things happen to data, all sorts of different things. And you can choose your favorite research cycle for what happens to the data. But what's important is that what happens to data during execution, during analysis, influence how data can be understood, how it might be reused, how it might be replicated in the future. And so these are perspectives that, as libraries, looking back to what we said that we're interested in and motivated in terms of taking past information through our current times to the future. These are all of these things that we're thinking about when we approach that topic of research data. And in thinking about provisioning for that replication, that reproducibility, that really motivates how we're thinking about the data beyond the current activity, beyond this execution, beyond this collection, beyond this analysis. Thinking about what was originally planned for. How did you plan for it? What were the systems that you brought in? What are the transformations you intend to do? Can you actually do those transformations from tool X to tool Y? How do you get there? How much information is lost? How much information is perverted during that transformation? And what do those activities that you perform on your data, what do they mean for that next user? If maybe you forgot to document how you cleaned your data, what was cut out of that data collection? Maybe for you, it wasn't data, but for the next reuser, or it wasn't important data, but for the next reuser, it really is just the key to the whole problem. So thinking about all of those aspects as we come into these data spaces. And this is very important when, for a researcher, you consider that the most likely next reuser of the data that they collect or analyze is themselves. They're themselves in the future, and thinking about that aspect of it as well. So when we think about, again, those, bringing those library-ish perspectives into the data space, it really is touching on those dimensions that we talked about, right? What are the human dimensions? How does the data interact with those principles of research scholarship, an open society? How does this influence how that information is organized? What does it mean to provide a diversity of knowledge and ideas and data with those fixed reference points? How do our technologies and tools, computational tools that we bring in, again, inflect and influence what can be understood as a record of society in those spaces of culture, research, and scholarship? And where does intellectual freedom come in? That freedom of access to information, and that, again, that special obligation to ensure that free flow of information and ideas across time and, across national borders and languages and all of those other fun complications. We won't even start talking about what does legal interoperability mean, because that's a whole another 2 hours at least. We don't have time for that. So when we come to data, along with the bits and the bytes and thinking about validation and replication, it's also these aspects that we're asking questions about from the library's perspective in these spaces, where we're considering whose research is it? Whose data is being represented? Who does own that? Whose knowledge is it? Who does it come from? What are the knowledge and information systems that it's being represented in? Is that fair, accurate, and complete representation of that knowledge? Does it represent how that knowledge should be represented from the people, perhaps, that the knowledge comes from? Can that data be reused? Should it be reused? Are there ways it should not be reused ever? Are there special conditions associated with it? And what do those appropriate reuses look like? What do those systems do? How do they work with each other? And these are all the many questions that we bring into these spaces around that research data and thinking about those things. So oftentimes when we're approaching data, we're really approaching it from that aspect of data management. And this is one of my favorite quotes about data management from Rex Sanders, who was with the USGS for an extended period of time. But that idea that the point here is that data should exist. You should be able to find that data. You should be able to understand that data. You should be able to tell whether or not you can trust that data, and that if that data is appropriate for your uses. And all of those are wrapped up in that idea of research data. And what has to happen to make those things occur is good data management across those spaces. So with that, I'd like to first take a pause and ask about any questions up to this point. Wow, you're all remarkably silent, which I've either struck you dumb with brilliance or you're just like, eh. But hopefully you can participate in the next part, because this is really thinking about, with all that, right? Taking all those ideas around data that libraries are bringing into this space, how does this connect with compute, right? How does this connect with what we're talking about in CART, in thinking about these? And this is where I'd like to hear from you, or for some of your thoughts on where this connects with compute. I obviously have lots of thoughts and ideas, and I've put up this handy diagram that you can point to. It's different stages of the research cycle, as like thinking about where compute comes in, where data is going through transformations and things like that. But please, I will do the professorly thing and count in my head for a set amount of time and wait for someone to speak up. Yeah, Scott.
In some cases, it's not even just acquisition. In a lot of cases, it's simulation. So it could be data creation or, simulated data being created, but treated as data for the purposes of, developing a workflow or developing something. And that goes all the way back through computation to the early days.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Simulated as it having a greater and greater role in spaces, especially with that concept of digital twins coming into a lot of the different health spaces as well. So simulated data is certainly a part of this crossover around thinking about what is that role across data, and thinking about how that simulated data was generated and how the understandings of those simulations accompany the data itself. Ray, I can't hear you. It looks like you were talking. Maybe it wasn't
Yeah,
me.
thank you. Thank you. I think one of the challenges too, this is a great chart, is as we try to provide computing resources in the information space, there can be this notion that if you have one computer, then you're done. But sometimes you need a HPC cluster, sometimes you need a laptop, sometimes you need the cloud. So I don't know if you've seen that or seen any guidelines on how to integrate, let's say, multiple systems into a chart like this. And then the other shoe to fall on that is, as soon as you start integrating multiple systems, now you have a data dispersion problem and a challenge to collect or reintegrate at some later step.
Yeah, very much so. And I think there are interesting crossovers with that challenge of not just accounting for the different compute systems that are required, but the different softwares that are used on
Hmm.
those, which
Yeah.
plays a role when we think about like what's reliable and replicable, repeatable research. Like what is the system? What's the software it's running on? How does it influence its repeatability? As well as that challenge, as you say, of the data dispersion, and thinking in those spaces about, how does metadata contribute to, you know, combating some of those challenges of data dispersion? How do we think about those ideas of managing the data and bringing that, converging with that in compute spaces to maybe help ameliorate some of those issues?
Amy, I think one of
Yeah.
the things that I think about, oh, sorry. if somebody
No,
else was
please
going
go
to
ahead.
speak.
Let's hear.
Yeah, just one of the things I think about in this space is the sort of gradual expansion of what needs to be managed, right? So I think when we now think about data management, we're thinking well beyond, like a researcher's spreadsheet. Particularly as we start to come up with develop these more computationally advanced techniques, thinking about things that are what I kind of think about as digital exhaust, right? And so that is, data that systems are generating that may not have been something that researchers could interrogate before, but now is. And so it needs to be brought under sort of how we think about research data management. And by extension, I think that starts to change like what libraries have traditionally thought of as data management, right?
I think you're right, is that there has to be a much broader consideration of the computational environment and how it influences and impacts the research, the analyses, the simulations that are created, and being able to use that, as you say, data exhaust, but perhaps that's more pejorative. But how to use that extra information that we now have, that increased context to understand how that research is being executed, how it's being performed, and what information it can give us about improved research replicability and reliability, improved understanding for reuse of these information materials. I would also encourage us, as a community, fully engaged in thinking about computation and data for our researchers, for our research communities, where each of these, what part each of these plays from the researcher perspective as well, right? This is part of that, how humans are interacting with information and with information technologies. And of course, compute is a large part of those information technologies. So we're thinking about, right, how does that influence the presence of computational technologies influence what ideas might even be possible? How does it get into the proposal, the planning? How are those environments influencing what happens during execution? How are those documented for reliability so that it can be reused? So we do have those reliable points of facts going into future. And then how are these materials, that full context of the research itself, shared beyond the research project in that true engagement of the research endeavor? And how is that shared not just within an institution, but how we think about sharing that for the global research endeavor as well, because that's the real community that, as researchers, as institutions, that we're often interacting in. So with that, like I said, oftentimes when we're in that space of trying to bring these disparate perspectives together, we stumble across those ourselves. And thinking about what are the terminologies that we use. So thinking about archiving versus preservation is a great big one, right? When we're talking about archiving versus preservation, are we thinking about making it findable and reusable for the future? Or are we thinking about take this group of files and we're going to stick it over here in a less accessible system to archive it because it will take fewer resources? Because those are very different understandings of what we mean when we say archives. When we're thinking about, metadata, and we talked before about like, what are some of the metadata that what are the goals, what are the purposes of metadata? And I think, Scott, your comment in chat is really apropos here too, is how to understand that comprehensive documentary effort that's necessary for supporting that full perspective of research, which often goes beyond technical and system generated metadata. Although to Moira's point, we have more and more of that, and really exploring how that can be useful in those spaces of thinking about reliability and reusability. Another space of confusion is often storage and backups, and what's the difference between an active storage or backup for execution, and thinking about lifecycle storage for preservation or risk mitigation. And when we're saying storage, which of those storages do we actually mean when we're like, hey, we need storage space. My researcher needs storage space. What is the storage space, that type of storage space we're talking about? How accessible is it? How does it influence sharing? for that next space of it, right? Are we talking about sharing within the project, within the team, or sharing publicly, broadly, as required by more of our funders, and certainly as required by those ethics of research itself, and what that actually means. I was wondering if people here have other areas or terminologies that they've stumbled across that have caused some confusion, or needed some shared explanation and understanding.
Amy, I will say a big one that I struggle with often is repository, the word repository.
Oh, repository. I was going to say, now, my friends, I know we all love our GitHub repos, but please, in my heart of hearts, do not call that a repository. And we can get into why that is. But again, that's another 15 to 10 minutes at least. But I can point you to the Core Trust Seal certification for repositories. I know GitHub is not those things at all. And yes, I see several nominations in chat for data. What are data? So I hope that whole section on data, this is what libraries are thinking when we're thinking about data and research data. And that idea of coming into, we even need to talk about what are data? What are those derivatives of data? What's included in that concept of data or research data? And how expansive and extensive it is. I love metadata. Yep. We have all sorts of different metadata. I'm getting to paradata. And yes, the idea of what is large? What is large? What is large in one discipline will be like, oh, I could no longer use Excel because I just had too many rows. Couldn't do it. And everyone else is like, oh, honey, you're working in Excel. That's not large. And significant, yes. What is statistically significant versus other types of significance? Yes, all of the data owner versus steward versus manager, user, creator, curator, the original source. So within that, I think these are really great things for us collectively in this space, even to talk about what are our shared understandings, what are the different understandings, and how do we productively engage with those conversations so that we can move forward together. Excelsior in those spaces, to take off and really bring our combined perspectives into a space that benefits that entire research and scholarship endeavor, whether that's for our institutions or in our networked areas of technology, of supports, of conversation, of communication across that global research endeavor. So thinking about, why do we do this thing, the preservation of knowledge? It's really about thinking about how that moves into the future. And so with that, thank you for your attention. Please check out the slide deck. There's further reading because I do like books and articles and things if you're interested in that. And I do want to attend to Paula's question there about, but did you talk about all of these wonderful organizations that are engaged with data? And Paula, no, I did not, because this was just like, hey, why are there libraries in this data space? And while libraries are also in those data spaces, we didn't get to them, yes. But if you are more interested in other places where data people, library people are coming together in joyful progress, yes, CoData, iAssist, RDAP, which is Research Data Access and Preservation, RDA, which is the Research Data Alliance, which we did mention, but mainly because I sat on council. CoData, which is the Council of Data, which is an international organization. iAssist, which I don't remember all of the letters, but it's social sciences and technology in that space and information, and that gets a lot of the letters. But open for questions and conversation.
I have a simple one. Are the
Yeah, go for it.
slides supposed to be available?
They are, and the link is in the notes document, and I will post the notes document again so you have access to all the things, and you can also sign in.
I signed in, and I don't have access to the slides.
Oh, well, access to the slides is a totally different thing. I'll go fix that.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same problem.
I do not own these slides. Moira, you can go fix that.
I can. I will fix that right now.
Thank you.
Apologies.
I had a question, and you already, at the risk of extending us for 2 hours, the intersection of the library or the information sciences and then compliance
Oh,
is that's increasing all the time, and I think it does touch a lot on some of the FAIR principles, especially for reusability. So,
Mhm.
any comments on the directions that you see, and any way we can defend ourselves? Maybe that's where the Excelsior comes in.
Perhaps. I think this is a really interesting question around compliance. And it's there's different aspects of compliance that we can approach, right? There's that idea of complying with privacy regulations. So you might be thinking about CUI, right? That controlled unclassified information. What does that mean for creating data enclaves that comply with those types of regulations? There are ideas of compliance with funders' requirements in terms of sharing data and all of those other things around the data as well, and thinking about what does compliance in that aspect mean. There are also ideas of compliance in terms of complying with disciplinary or social expectations around what can and should be done with the data and information, and thinking about those spaces. And I think there are different people at any institution that are concerned with those different aspects. And one of the things about libraries is that we're often coming into this space as a purveyor of information about how one might comply, but not as compliance officers.
Right.
Really preferring to take on that role as remaining as a space, again, for that openness, thinking about how information flows. So if you're looking at libraries as that place who, and this is something we do within my institution, is I partner absolutely with our research compliance and integrity offices around, educating, around thinking about how we satisfy both compliance with legal requirements as well as compliance with funder requirements in terms of openness and what is expected in those research spaces. I think Moira offered earlier as part of my introduction that I have a background in the pharmaceutical industry. And part of that background is actually working with FDA compliance as well as international compliance bodies in those spaces. So that's an aspect, that I personally bring to this space. But that you'll probably find other people with those types of experiences as well. So what kind of compliance were you thinking of, Ray?
Largely, what we're seeing out of agency compliance, especially NIH, now that some of the DB gap data, for instance, is now under higher compliance than it was before. And what I'm trying to see too is just what you said, the integration there of libraries being able to advise, but then not necessarily assert that people are within compliance. So that's the main one I think now is what's going through the NIH, but it's it's everywhere.
Yeah, it is, and it's a huge challenge to our compute systems as well as to our researchers in thinking about what that means and how do we balance those demands for the DB gap information that's been swept up into that compliance space, and how do we continue to support openness and advancement of human knowledge going forward while still being active, being correct in that compliance. I do want to, Melissa.
So I think one of the biggest weaknesses that I'm seeing with some of my researchers is the data management portion. They don't know what data they have. They don't know where it's all kept. This grad student threw this file in this folder 16 years ago, but somebody's still using it. Is this now under some different compliance regime, but they've forgotten it's there? So, with some of these compliances and, changes to services and, repositories and things like that, I've been proposing a full audit of what data we have so we can start having those architectural discussions about, and whether is this a person, educational training kind of side of thing, or is this something from a technology standpoint that we have to architect a solution for? And so knowing what data you have and even where it's at is probably the biggest hurdle that I see to both, replication of, research, and also to Ray's point, to the compliance aspect of data management as well.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you, Melissa. That's a huge challenge. And the first question we often ask any researcher who comes to us, whether they're in the planning stage or the, oh my goodness stage, is like, tell us about what data you have.
And trying to get them to articulate, is this HIPAA data? Is this de-identified data? Like sometimes they're just like, the terminology isn't resonating across what I'm using versus what they're using. So finding kind of the definitions, the legalese definitions are often not helping them make determinations about what their requirements are.
Yeah, very much so. And this is, so two things. One, you had mentioned, is this a technology solution issue, or is this a training and education solution or issue? And I think the correct response is and. It's both. It's absolutely both. And beyond that as well, is that it requires a cultural change across our institutes to treat these issues with more importance and with more with a more consistent approach, that understanding what it is that you produce within the institution goes beyond just reporting what articles that you published, right? Data should be part of that recognized research material product as well, and thinking about how, as a researcher, one might account for it, and thinking about institutionally how our systems support that accounting for, that acknowledgement of, that getting credit for that full approach to research rather than just the article, which is ultimately a very small part of the research endeavor as well. All work in there together, which is why I think this idea of being able to work productively together from the perspective of libraries as well as compute, and in those administration spaces where we're looking at compliance aspects, really is becoming more and more important across the board. So thank you. Amy.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about the compliance component, and for me, librarians definitely are educators. That's kind of a place that we are most comfortable, is setting up the environment to inform about something or to advise, but we don't always, like you said, we don't take that authoritative role to say, you must do this. We usually are providing resources or education about something. So to me, that's part of my role, is to be an educator. And also I do shout out RDAP because, in the name of RDAP is access and preservation. And that's what I really think of my role as a librarian, is to really help facilitate access and preservation. So in the roles that I think about where it's appropriate for me to do something, that's my guiding mantra. And that's kind of what, makes a library different from, like you said, an archive. I mean, you can go to an archive, like we have a classics archive here on campus. You can go there, but you usually can't take the stuff with you. You have to use it in the space. And for libraries, a lot of it is about the reuse and getting access and really working with the materials. So again, my mantra is the access and preservation. And that's why, for me, it's makes total sense to be in the area of data, because it's access and preservation of information, right? So.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Amy. Yeah. That was the third response, Melissa, is libraries are here to help teach. We are all about how do we best share that information, and to some extent that translation of information, right? I still, when I go to humanities departments, I do not use the word data. I just don't, because it culturally often erects a barrier where the audience can no longer hear anything else I say once I've brought data into the conversation, because their self-identity is very much, we don't do data. What are you even talking to us about? And really that, again, is part of the perspective we're bringing in as libraries, is that human interaction with information and that approach to, meeting the user at their point of need and truly understanding what that, trying to get to the underlying need in those spaces. And as Paula has extended on, as has Melissa, about the simple challenges around exploring what data are, and developing that description around data, and how helping the researcher understand what it means to really understand their data, because they may have come to you and be like, yeah, I am the world expert on my data, thank you so much. And you start asking, you're like, okay, let's take some of these other approaches to data as well and see if we can together extend understanding of those data materials that you have.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to just, if there are other questions for Amy, maybe time for one more point of discussion. Paula, you came off mute. You going to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I found that researchers don't always, because of the definitional problems of the term data, that don't they don't realize what they have that are data. And they don't understand that you need to know where it came from. So the provenance, where did it come, why do you trust these numbers or data or information, whatever it is you've gathered? And so I try to, it's super awkward, but I try to avoid using the term data because it isn't helpful. And just today I'm having trouble because somebody has a collection of 600,000 text files, and those aren't data. And I'm just like, yes, they are. That's exactly what's the problem. No, the data are the derivative numbers that we created when we analyzed those text files. I'm like, I know those are data, yeah, those too. But and so they're not connecting the two. They're not, it's super duper problematic. So what I'm saying is, what have you collected in order to come up with this solution? How have you organized this information so that it is retrievable by you and probably other people in the future? And then we ease into, oh, look, it's ready to deposit in an archive that knows how to handle it over time. But you can't, if I start with, where's your data? I'm going to get an Excel file. And it's super problematic.
Very much so.
And I think in conversations I've had with researchers, Paula, to that point, getting them to understand that you have a specific question you're asking of whatever it is you're generating or collecting, but that other people could have a different question, and that the value of what is coming out of your research can extend beyond your immediate context, right? I think that's a helpful conversation to have with folks too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the other challenges, and talking about researchers with what are all of the information that they have collected in pursuit of this question, and then connecting that with, how does all of that information show up in our technology and in our information systems? Do we actually have systems that can support, as you're saying, Paula, all of those different aspects of description for that information? How, because I think I would posit that that's one of the challenges, that our systems themselves have defined what data are. And that's part of the shortcoming. So thinking about developing systems that extend that definition of data, that include those broad descriptions of what is having a space where provenance is recorded, having a space, where you can attach that description of what stage of analysis or cleaning are the data at, would help, in addition, extend the researcher's understandings of all of the information that surrounds that information that they've collected as part of the pursuit of their researcher. So thinking about, what are the integrations and how those systems influence each other, influencing the understanding of themselves, is part of our own conversation here in this space.
Yeah. Have any of you used Open Science Framework to help people construct their infrastructure to support the research they're doing?
I use the cheer protocol for some conversations as a really quick and easy way for some disciplines of research to help them set up structures. In that, if you're familiar with it at all.
Chair protocol, is that what you used?
I'll get it for you. I'll get it for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
And while she gets that link, we are basically at time. So I want to hope everyone will join me in thanking Amy Nurnberger so much for taking the time to talk us through this today. I thought this was a really helpful discussion, and I hope that you all will join us next month. We will circulate the slides and the recording of the call and any other information that we've generated as part of this discussion. Thanks again. It's good to see everybody.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks
Thank you,
all.
Amy, so much. This was great. And I'm going to stop the recording.